Tick History is a military history YouTuber producing content mainly on the Second World War. Occasionally, he makes videos on related areas of history such as political ideology, economics, and religion. A distinctive characteristic of Tick's videos is his extensive use of sources. He cites them specifically, even down to the page number, provides direct quotations, and sometimes describes relevant details of the authors he is using. He typically links to a Google document spreadsheet listing all his sources for that particular video, though recently he has often just linked to a spreadsheet of all the sources he has used for any video without identifying which ones were used for the video you are watching, which is much less useful and obscures his sources rather than revealing them. Nevertheless, even in these cases, Tick still cites the sources he has used on screen and sometimes quotes from them directly. As a result, Tick has gained a reputation for reliability, accuracy, and good research practices. However, the reality is that Tick's use of sources is highly inconsistent. In this video, I'll show you how Tick's videos on a number of topics, especially non-military topics, repeatedly suffer from biased sources, incorrect sources, and misrepresented sources. As with any other history YouTuber, including myself, you can't trust Tick's videos just because they cite sources. And when you see the repeated pattern of source mismanagement which is found throughout Tick's videos on certain subjects, you'll understand why you shouldn't trust his use of sources unless you've checked them independently. In this video, I've cited Tick's sources using the bibliographic information provided by Tick, though sometimes I've had to correct this since Tick occasionally misattributes books by getting the author's name wrong. Biased sources. Very frequently, Tick cites sources in support of his views without revealing that they are significantly biased in favor of his views. This is particularly the case when he makes content on economics. Although he's quick to identify economists he disagrees with as Marxist, Socialist, or Keynesian, which he does so disparagingly, indicating to his audience that these sources should not be trusted, he typically cites economists to support his arguments without revealing their biases or that they hold fringe economic views which are very far from mainstream and not taken seriously by most professional economists. Very often, the works he cites from these authors are not professional publications or peer-reviewed articles, but blog posts, website articles, or books which are either published by non-academic trade presses, self-published, or published by special interest groups to support their agenda. None of this means they are necessarily wrong, but it does mean their work is biased towards Tick's personal views, and their work hasn't been subjected to the standard processes of academic quality control. At the very least, Tick should tell his viewers this. When he is discussing economics, Tick often cites the works of authors who belong to the so-called Austrian school of economics, including Ludwig von Mises, a leading figure of the Austrian school throughout the 20th century. Tick doesn't tell his audience that the Austrian school is a radical form of libertarian economics which emerged in the late 19th century and which is regarded as both heterodox and fringe by mainstream economists, due mainly to its rejection of empirical testing and validation. In a 2019 book chapter, economist Nikolai J. Voss argues that this has resulted in Austrian economics, quote, basically dying out as a voice in the conversation of modern economists, end quote. You can guarantee Tick is not going to tell you that. Whenever Tick cites an Austrian school economist in order to support his arguments, he really should inform his audience that his source is biased toward a particularly extreme definition of capitalism, and that the economic theory his source supports is fringe, heterodox, and deliberately not based on empirical evidence. Let's look first at the works Tick cites which have biased views on economics. Thomas DiLorenzo. Tick cites Thomas DiLorenzo's book The Problem with Socialism, published by Regnery Publishing. This is not a professionally published or peer-reviewed work. Regnery Publishing is a company which openly describes itself as, quote, America's leading publisher of conservative books, end quote, so very obviously biased, and DiLorenzo is an Austrian school economist who is also the president of the Ludwig von Mises Institute, an organization dedicated to the promotion of Austrian school economics. David Gordon. Tick cites libertarian philosopher David Gordon's book, An Introduction to Economic Reasoning. This is not a professionally published or peer-reviewed work, and it was published by the Ludwig von Mises Institute. Hans Hermann Hoppe. Tick cites Hans Hermann Hoppe's book, A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism. This is not a professionally published or peer-reviewed work. It was published by the Ludwig von Mises Institute, and Hoppe is an Austrian school economist. Jörg Guido Hülsmann. Tick cites Jörg Guido Hülsmann's book, Mises, The Last Night of Liberalism. This is not a professionally published or peer-reviewed work. It was published by the Ludwig von Mises Institute, and Hülsmann is an Austrian school economist. Ryan McMaken. Tick cites Ryan McMaken's article, Poverty Forced Farmers in the Good Old Days to Sleep the Winter Away. This is not a professionally published or peer-reviewed work, or even a formal publication. It is an article on the website of the Mises Institute, and McMaken is an Austrian school economist. Carl Menger. Tick cites Carl Menger's book, Principles of Economics. This is not a professionally published or peer-reviewed work. It was published by the Mises Institute, and Menger is another Austrian school economist. Robert Murphy. Tick cites Robert Murphy's book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism, published by Regnery Publishing. This is not a professionally published or peer-reviewed work. We already know Regnery Publishing is a company specializing in publishing conservative literature, so very obviously biased, and Murphy is another Austrian school economist. Christian Niemitz. Tick cites Christian Niemitz's book, Socialism, the Failed Idea That Never Dies. This is not a professionally published or peer-reviewed work. It was published by the Mises Institute, and Niemitz is another Austrian school economist. Llewellyn H. Rockwell Jr. Tick cites Llewellyn H. Rockwell Jr.'s book, The Left, the Right, and the State. This is not a professionally published or peer-reviewed work. It was published by the Mises Institute, and Rockwell is a right-wing paleo-libertarian and self-described anarcho-capitalist who is the chairman of the Mises Institute in Alabama. Adam Young. Tick cites Adam Young's journal article, Nazism is Socialism. This is not a professionally published or peer-reviewed work. It was published by the Mises Institute, and Young is a self-described Austrian economics libertarian. L.K. Samuels. Tick cites L.K. Samuels' book, Killing History, The False Left-Right Political Spectrum, published by Freeland Press. This is not a professionally published or peer-reviewed work. Freeland Press is a small company which has published a total of 4 books under its own business name, all 4 of which were written by L.K. Samuels, 3 of which are fiction. Samuels himself is a libertarian author with a bachelor degree in commercial art and journalism, not a scholarly source for historical, political, or economic commentary. Thomas Sowell. Tick cites several books from Thomas Sowell, a conservative libertarian economist and historian of economics. Although Sowell is a professional economist, his last scholarly work was decades ago, and he has not published any peer-reviewed work since about 1980. One of Sowell's books cited by Tick is The Vision of the Anointed. This is a non-scholarly work printed by a small trade publisher, not an academic press, presenting Sowell's views on socially influential individuals and organizations and how they become convincing without proving themselves worthy of trust. It is not a book on economics. Another of Sowell's books cited by Tick is Economic Facts and Fallacies. This is also a non-scholarly work printed by a small trade publisher, not an academic press, and represents little more than Sowell's conservative personal opinions on economics. Another of Sowell's books cited by Tick is The Housing Boom and Bust, written in response to the 2008 US subprime mortgage crisis. Instead of taking a libertarian stance on the housing bubble, Sowell argues the government was to blame for not regulating the credit industry sufficiently. Another of Sowell's books cited by Tick is Trickle-Down Theory and Tax Cuts for the Rich, published by the Hoover Institution Press. Again, this is not a scholarly work, it is not peer-reviewed, it is only 20 pages long, and although the Hoover Institution Press is a university press, it belongs to the Hoover Institution, a right-wing libertarian think tank. The book argues in favour of so-called trickle-down or supply-side economics, a policy which has been widely critiqued by mainstream economists as unhelpful at best and actually harmful at worst. Another of Sowell's books cited by Tick is Basic Economics, a common-sense guide to the economy, a simple introduction to economics for non-specialists printed by a small trade publisher, not an academic press. It is not a scholarly work, though it is not intended to be. None of these books by Sowell are scholarly or peer-reviewed works, and it is clear Tick is only citing them because he can extract from them statements on economics with which he agrees. If you look at professional websites used to assess the scholarly impact and relevance of economists, you will find Sowell barely registers. Rainer Zeitelmann. Tick cites Rainer Zeitelmann's book Hitler's National Socialism in the videos in which he argues that the Nazis' National Socialism was real socialism. Tick doesn't tell his viewers that Zeitelmann is explicitly a pro-capitalist, and his work defending capitalism has been published by organizations such as the Austrian Institute and Cato Institute, both of which promote libertarianism and the Austrian School of Economics. In an article written for the website Family Wealth Report, Zeitelmann explains, quote, "My views align with a lot of libertarian positions, and I am a great admirer of the books of Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich August von Hayek," end quote. However, Zeitelmann does not explicitly call himself a libertarian, and typically speaks of libertarians as other than himself. Unlike most libertarians, and unlike Tick himself, Zeitelmann has a balanced definition of capitalism which does not necessitate a completely free and unregulated market. In an interview in 2020, when asked, quote, "Many left-wingers claim that pure socialism has never been tried. Do you think pure capitalism has ever been tried?" End quote. Zeitelmann replied, quote, "Pure socialism and pure capitalism do not exist and have never existed anywhere. Almost all systems are mixed systems," end quote. Tick doesn't tell his viewers this either, possibly because he disagrees with it, or maybe he just doesn't know. Zeitelmann added, quote, "Some libertarians dream of a pure capitalist system, perhaps even one without any form of centralized government whatsoever. I don't believe in utopias of any kind," end quote. This is something else Tick doesn't mention. Now let's look at some works Tick cites which have other biases. Leonid Peikoff. Tick cites several books by objectivist philosopher Leonid Peikoff, whom he cites in a number of his videos, such as The Cult Many Are In But Don't Realize, and From Plato to Hitler, The Ideological Origins of National Socialism, and Where Do Our Modern Ideologies Come From?, and Hegel's Ideobabble is the basis of Marxism and fascism. For this, he relies heavily on Peikoff's book Founders of Western Philosophy, Thales to Hume. This was published by the Ayn Rand Institute Press. The Ayn Rand Institute is an organization dedicated to the promotion of the objectivist philosophy of Russian-American philosopher Ayn Rand. Peikoff is a follower and promoter of Rand's philosophy and is the founder of the Ayn Rand Institute. Tick's reliance on Peikoff's history of philosophy is very likely one of the reasons why he does not understand the philosophers to whom he refers, in particular Plato and Heraclitus. Peikoff's work is basically a publication of his lectures on philosophy and was not published academically or through a process of peer review. It is typically found cited by libertarians and followers of Rand's objectivist philosophy. Another of Peikoff's books cited by Tick is The Cause of Hitler's Germany. Originally published in 1982, Tick cites the 2014 edition published by Plume, a regular trade press. This is not a scholarly work, did not pass through a peer review process, and I have not found any scholarly reviews of it. Another of Peikoff's books cited by Tick is Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. This is simply Peikoff's synthesis of Rand's objectivism, published by Penguin, a respectable trade publisher. Tick has cited this book as being influential on him personally, but does not cite it in support of his claims regarding history, politics, or economics. Another of Peikoff's books cited by Tick is The Dim Hypothesis, Why the Lights of the West Are Going Out. printed by New American Library, a regular trade press. This is Peikoff's attempt to present an objectivist view of history and an explanation for why the Western world is, according to Peikoff, in decline. I haven't found this work reviewed by any mainstream scholars. I found 2 fairly positive reviews in objectivist journals, but that doesn't really count given the work itself is objectivist and so is Peikoff. So these reviews are not exactly, well, objective. I did find a review by an average member of the public, which is supposedly the book's target audience, but it wasn't very positive. The reviewer ended by commenting, quote, "I came away from this book with the feeling that Peikoff doesn't know what he is talking about, and furthermore that he's so tangled up that he has no idea that he doesn't know what he's talking about." End quote. Robert Lee Trosinski. Tick cites Robert Lee Trosinski's book What Went Right? An Objectivist Theory of History. This is not a professionally published or peer-reviewed work. It seems to have been self-published through TPC Books, and as the title suggests, Trosinski is a conservative follower of Rand's objectivist ideology. The only review I found of this book was in an objectivist journal. Incorrect sources. In this section, I'll identify 3 sources on which Tick relies heavily for all his videos on Gnosticism, as well as his videos on the philosophical history of Marxism and National Socialism, and demonstrate that these sources make claims which are completely false. This is particularly unfortunate for Tick, given that at least half a dozen of his videos are very dependent on these sources. Eric Voegelin. Tick gets a lot of his ideas about Gnosticism and politics from the German philosopher Eric Voegelin. Tick makes this explicit in his video The Real Religion Behind National Socialism, saying, quote, "Hardly anyone had identified the actual religion that was behind National Socialism. Eric Voegelin had in the 1930s and onwards, but he seems to have been the exception to the rule." End quote. Eric Voegelin is a totally irrelevant source for Gnosticism. Quite apart from the fact that he was not at all a specialist on the subject, he read hardly any of the primary texts and instead relied heavily on interpretations of them by 19th century and early 20th century scholars. This was not entirely his fault. Anyone writing about Gnosticism in the 1930s would have been almost completely ignorant of the topic. At the time Voegelin was writing, there were almost no Gnostic texts available at all. Most of what was available about Gnosticism was in the form of statements and claims, typically extremely critical, in the writings of early Christian writers opposing what they considered heresy. But this consisted of less than 70 pages. Outside the Christian writers, up until 1945, there were only about 9 or 10 actual Gnostic texts available, providing extremely little information about Gnosticism. In 1945, a huge collection of texts was found in Egypt, sealed in clay jars. This collection became known as the Nag Hammadi Library after the name of the nearby village. Many of the texts were Gnostic, providing valuable insights into Gnosticism, but the process of their publication and translation was very slow. By 1965, only a fraction of them had been read and edited, and less than 10% had been translated into English. So when Voegelin was writing about Gnosticism in the 1930s, he was working almost completely in the dark, without access to reliable sources. He had practically no knowledge of real Gnosticism or access to genuine Gnostic texts. Consequently, he was heavily dependent on secondary sources, in particular Swiss theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar, who wrote an introduction to the work of the 2nd century Christian Irenaeus of Lyon, who critiqued Gnosticism, and German philosopher Hans Jonas, who was studying Gnosticism from the texts available to him. Voegelin borrowed the very idea of a connection between Gnosticism and modern political ideology from the work of Hans Jonas. Voegelin's reliance on these secondary sources, which were themselves highly uninformed about Gnosticism, led him into many errors. One was the false idea of the historical transmission of Gnosticism from antiquity to the modern era, and another was his false understanding of Gnosticism itself, which is significantly different to what we find in Gnostic texts, and is based not so much on actual Gnostic ideas, but more on Voegelin's understanding of religious and secular concepts of an imminent end of the age, preceded by a great crisis and succeeded by an era of utopian renewal. Tieck doesn't mention any of this, quite possibly because he simply doesn't know much about Voegelin, the source of his ideas, or what he actually wrote. In his own analysis of Voegelin, political philosopher Hans Kelsen wrote, quote, "Although Voegelin devotes a great part of his study to the allegedly decisive influence of Gnosticism on modern civilization, he is very vague concerning the meaning of this term as used by him. He gives nowhere a clear definition or precise characterization of that spiritual movement which he calls Gnosticism. He does not refer to Corinthus, Carpocrates, Basilides, Valentinus, Bardesanes, Marcion, or any other leader of the Gnostic sects, all belonging to the first centuries of the Christian era." End quote. In particular, Kelsen critiqued Voegelin's interpretation of Marxism as a form of mystic Gnosticism, writing, quote, "To interpret the rationalistic, outspoken anti-religious, anti-metaphysical philosophy of Feuerbach and Marx as mystic Gnosticism, to speak of a Marxian transfiguration of man into God, and to say of the atheistic theory of Marx that it carries to its extreme a less radical medieval experience which draws the spirit of God into man while leaving God himself in his transcendence, is, to formulate it as politely as possible, a gross misinterpretation." End quote. You'll find that a lot in modern scholarship on Voegelin's views of Gnosticism. As politely as possible, scholars tell you very frankly that Voegelin didn't know what he was talking about. Voegelin was so uninformed about Gnosticism and had so little access to Gnostic texts that he totally misled his own readers about the best sources on the subject, claiming, quote, "Gnostic heresy was the great opponent of Christianity in the early centuries, and Irenaeus surveyed and criticized the manifold of its variants in his Adversus Heresias, circa 180, a standard treatise on the subject that still will be consulted with profit." End quote. Even at the time Voegelin was writing this, in 1952, this was a laughably false statement. Irenaeus was a bishop in Lyon, now in France, whose book was just a collection of any ideas he considered theologically suspect and outside the boundary of correct Christianity. Firstly, it's important to note that Irenaeus didn't actually write of or even think in terms of Gnostics. Most of his writings were against the group called the Valentinians, who held some beliefs which modern scholars have retrospectively categorized as Gnostic, but whose actual system of belief is extremely convoluted and highly syncretic, mixing Christian beliefs with Greek philosophy and possibly also Egyptian mythology, since Valentinus himself was born in Egypt and seems to use or allude to some Egyptian terms. So no, the book by Irenaeus is by no means a standard treatise on Gnosticism. It's Irenaeus' own personal objections to the Valentinians, some of whose beliefs are retrospectively classified as Gnostic, but to whom Irenaeus simply refers as the followers of Valentinus, not the Gnostics. There are Gnostic elements in amongst all this, but it's an extremely narrow cross-section of what was really a far broader network of Gnostic beliefs. It's a mere pinhole glimpse into unorthodox Christian beliefs during the time of Irenaeus. Voegelin claimed that Gnosticism had been taught continually from antiquity and was present in the modern political ideologies of his era, in particular Marxism. Apart from gesturing vaguely at the works of earlier writers who made unsubstantiated claims, how did Voegelin support his own argument that the Gnostics had survived antiquity and that their beliefs had been transmitted throughout the Middle Ages all the way up to the 20th century? Simple. He didn't. He just made the claim, said he didn't have time to provide evidence for it, then treated it as fact. Philosopher Friedrich Kwiatkowski says, quote, "Being unable to give any historical proof to support this view, Voegelin resorts to the following evasive statement. The economy of this lecture does not allow a description of the gnosis of antiquity or of the history of its transmission into the Western Middle Ages. Enough to say that at the time, Gnosis was a living religious culture on which men could fall back." End quote. That's quite a hand wave. Imagine making a huge argument that Gnosticism had somehow survived over 1800 years from the 2nd to the 20th century, and then at the point at which it would be really helpful to provide evidence for this massive claim, suddenly resorting to, "I don't have time to tell you how it happened, just trust me, bro." Remember, this is the source Tick is relying on for his entire claim about the history of Gnosticism. Tick's relying on "trust me, bro." If you want more detail, I have already made a couple of videos demonstrating how badly Tick has misunderstood the history of Gnosticism, mainly due to his misunderstanding of sources and his use of poor sources. See the links in the video description. James Lindsay. In his videos on Gnosticism, Tick also identifies his reliance on a video by the new atheist and conservative culture critic James Lindsay. Tick cites several of Lindsay's videos in his list of sources. There is also a strong similarity between Tick's video and an earlier video by Lindsay, uploaded on the 4th of April 2023, entitled "The Queer Gnostic Cult," in which Lindsay attacks queer theory, claiming, quote, "Strange as this gender ideology may seem, perverse as it is, it can only be understood in terms of the esoteric cult religious structures called Gnosticism and Hermeticism." It's worth knowing that Lindsay is a promoter of transphobic propaganda. Tick shouldn't be using Lindsay as a source on Gnosticism, since Lindsay's work is not only distorted by his ideology, it's also extremely uninformed. Lindsay is about as useful a source on Gnosticism as Voegelin, mainly because, like Tick, Lindsay relies on Voegelin, and his understanding of Gnosticism is completely flawed as a result. Lindsay has no relevant academic qualifications. His qualifications are in mathematics and massage. He has never published any relevant peer-reviewed work, and he is a promoter of various right-wing conspiracy theories. He is not a reliable source on history or political ideology, let alone the highly specialized field of Gnosticism. In 2022, Lindsay published a book entitled "Race Marxism: The Truth About Critical Race Theory and Practice," which argues that critical race theory is just a kind of Marxism and is also racist. The book was self-published and is not taken seriously in any relevant field of scholarship. A common feature of Lindsay's work is his effort to connect things he doesn't like with Marxism and/or Gnosticism. Consequently, he argues queer theory is Gnosticism, critical race theory is Marxism, transgender theory is Gnosticism and Marxism itself is Gnosticism. None of this is based in any empirical research or scholarly engagement with any relevant academic field. It's just wildly wrong. Tick should at least tell his viewers this information about Lindsay so they know who he is relying on and asking them to trust. Since Lindsay is largely an online culture warrior and does not engage with mainstream scholars, his work is almost completely ignored by academia. However, occasionally it is possible to find scholars commenting on his work and correcting his misconceptions. One such instance is PhD candidate Jason Barton's article, "The Gnostic Accusation," in the Journal for Continental Philosophy of Religion. A few quotations will suffice. Early on in his article, Barton writes, quote, "My task in the current section is twofold. 1. Identify a set of inaccuracies in Lindsay's interpretation of Hegelianism, and 2. Connect these inaccuracies to the broader trend of saddling Hegel with Gnostic commitments." End quote. All through his article, Barton explains how Lindsay has misunderstood Hegel and Gnosticism, prefacing his corrections with phrases such as, quote, "Lindsay incorrectly describes Hegelian speculative dialectics," end quote, and, quote, "Lindsay erroneously frames the moment of speculative reasoning," end quote, and, quote, "Lindsay demonstrates his misunderstanding," end quote. You can find the entire 24-page paper in the list of references linked in the video description. A. E. Samaan. In his video, Why Hitler Was Made Man of the Year in 1938, Tick makes the claim that after 1945, quote, "the Holocaust was all but forgotten until the late 1970s," end quote, adding, quote, "For decades, World War II historians stuck to tanks," end quote, and further asserting, quote, "Even Hollywood and our TV boxes largely ignored the topic, and it wasn't until the fall of the Soviet Union and the advent of the internet that interest in the Holocaust really got going," end quote. To support this claim, he cites only a single source, stating, quote, "As Samaan makes clear, and there are books written on this very topic, scholarly interest in the Holocaust didn't get going until 40 years after the war. 40 years! and we're now going through a sort of boom in Holocaust literature, end quote. Tick is referring to the book From a Race of Masters to a Master Race by A.E. Samaan, which is actually the pen name of the author, who describes himself as an independent historian on his LinkedIn page. His book was originally self-published electronically in 2014 through the website CreateSpace, an early electronic self-publishing service owned by Amazon. A print edition was published in 2020 by Library Without Walls, a startup publishing company. So it's not an academic work and hasn't been peer-reviewed. As we've already seen, Tick has a demonstrable tendency to rely on non-scholarly publications for some of his boldest arguments, and clearly doesn't always check them for accuracy, which is a serious flaw in his research methodology. I have found only one scholarly review of Samaan's book in a 2014 volume of The Quarterly Review of Biology, where it was reviewed quite favourably for its historical account of eugenics and racialized biology. However, the reviewer had some criticisms, such as, quote, "The narrative is that of a PhD thesis with massive amounts of quotes but no formal bibliography of the cited works," end quote. This reflects Samaan's unfamiliarity with standard academic practices. Later, the reviewer observed, quote, "Many historians would question Samaan's belief that something like Ayn Rand's, not Spencer's, version of libertarianism would have prevented the Holocaust," end quote. We've already seen Tick cite libertarians, Austrian school economists, and followers of Ayn Rand in his other videos, so it's not a surprise that he relies on another libertarian and Rand sympathizer for his claim about the alleged post-war academic silence on the Holocaust. The reviewer doesn't comment at all on the accuracy of Samaan's claim of an academic silence on the Holocaust, but does compliment Samaan for integrating a large body of research demonstrating the connections between eugenics and the Holocaust. However, the reviewer critiques Samaan for viewing history through a, quote, "libertarian filter," end quote, and adds, quote, "The manuscript would have benefited from traditional peer review by outside experts before publishing," end quote. The reviewer also notes that Samaan describes himself as, quote, "an architect, designer, mechanic, artist, photographer, and student of pre-Columbian architecture in Latin America," end quote, demonstrating he has no professional qualifications in history. That doesn't mean he is wrong, but does make me wonder why Tick chose this source. It should be a cause for concern that Tick is relying on a single source for such a significant claim. We should ask why Tick is citing a fringe work like this by a non-academic author instead of mainstream peer-reviewed scholarly literature. He should have consulted more than one source, or at least checked to see if Samaan's claim was accurate before repeating it. However, that would have required consulting peer-reviewed scholarly literature and the academic consensus, which Tick is quite reluctant to do these days as a result of his somewhat conspiratorial concern that universities and scholarship more broadly have become corrupted by Marxism, and that professional historians in particular have a strong tendency to simply repeat narratives approved by economic and political elites. I'll return to this point later in this video. This concern is reflected in the video in which he cites Samaan, in which he asserts, quote, "The accurate perception of what National Socialism and Fascism was prior to the war was changed to fit the narrative that the establishment wanted you to think. During the war, they took over the media. It was nationalized. It still is. Follow the money," end quote. He then claims, quote, "Then the West allied with the Soviet Union and adopted the Marxist narrative that National Socialism and Fascism were the end stages of capitalism because that was convenient for the Western establishment who were looking to implement their own controls over the economy. The Second World War and the Cold War that followed it changed the narrative and distorted the truth about the nature of National Socialism, Fascism, Western democracy, and Marxism," end quote. It's unclear where he is getting this idea from, since he doesn't cite any sources substantiating any of this. It is certainly counterintuitive for Tick to claim that the West was allied with the Soviet Union after World War II, given the intensity of the Cold War and the 40 years of extremely high animosity and geopolitical tension between the USSR and the Western nations the Cold War involved. When we do the work which Tick should have done, we find that Samaan's assertion is in fact a myth which has not only been identified as a myth for years, but which is contradicted by a considerable body of historical evidence. There's a book called We Remember with Reverence and Love, American Jews and the Myth of Silence After the Holocaust, 1945 to 1962, published in 2009 by New York University Press. Totally unlike Saman's book, this is a scholarly work written by Professor Hasia Dina, a professional historian with a bachelor, master and doctorate degrees, and published by an academic press. Consequently, it has been highly influential in Holocaust scholarship and reviewed widely by academics. This is the kind of book Tick should have been citing. Dina's work comprehensively dismantles the myth Tick repeats from Saman, describing the relevant history starting at least as early as 1949, when the Jewish Museum in New York exhibited the work of a Jewish painter and included in the accompanying brochure a reference to, quote, the Nazi Holocaust, which threatened the very existence of the Jews, end quote. Dina also cites a study guide for teachers published in 1954 entitled What Do You Know About Jewish Religion, History, Ethics and Culture, which made explicit reference to the Holocaust, calling it a, quote, ghastly program of extermination, end quote. Dina also cites another exhibition at the New York Jewish Museum in 1958, which, quote, mentioned by name in its press release two notable pieces, The Survivors and Holocaust, end quote. The book is full of such examples, mainly covering the years 1952 to 1962, describing how Jewish people in the US, as well as non-Jewish scholars in the US and elsewhere, started documenting, analyzing, and publicizing Jewish experiences of the Holocaust almost immediately after the war had ended. I've not only read various sections of this book myself to gain an understanding of its coverage and the extent of its bibliography, I've also read several scholarly reviews of it, which you'll find listed in my source list, linked to in the video description, and I'll quote from one of those reviews now. A 2010 review in the academic journal Shofar, an interdisciplinary journal of Jewish studies, says, quote, Hasia Dina thoroughly discredits the theory of the myth of silence, end quote. The same review describes how Dina proves, quote, articles in books, magazines, newspapers, scholarly journals, and other venues shared insights about the Holocaust not only within the Jewish community, but with the broader American community as well, end quote. It's important to note that this book was published in 2009, and the book by Saman, on which Tick relies, was first published 3 years later. So why did Saman repeat in his book a myth which had already been comprehensively dismantled in mainstream scholarship 3 years earlier? It seems he simply wasn't aware of the most recent academic work on the subject, which just demonstrates why Tick shouldn't have been relying on this fringe source in the first place. Another book written for the same purpose is After the Holocaust, Challenging the Myth of Silence, published in 2012. At least Saman could be forgiven for not being aware of this work, since it was published after his own, but Tick should have been looking for this kind of book. Published by Routledge, a printer of academic and professional books, this is another work presenting a mass of material demonstrating that the alleged silence cited by Tick is a myth. As with the previous book, I read scholarly reviews of this one, though I haven't read the book myself. One review says, quote, it is now widely acknowledged that the immediate post-war years were anything but silent when it came to the subject of the Holocaust. Of course, the concept of the Holocaust, as we understand it today, did not yet exist, but that is partly the point in this fine new collection representing the most important current scholarship. From at least the early 1940s, testimonies were being given, archives established, books and plays written, films made, and commemorations organized, end quote. But rather than just relying on these two works, I went looking for evidence of scholarly commentary on the Holocaust during the period in question, in particular for evidence that it was being studied and taught academically. It wasn't hard to find examples. One of the first I found was a teacher's study guide entitled Writings of the Nazi Holocaust, the Image of the Jew in Literature, published in 1969. This was particularly important since it's a 30-page document providing teachers with a lesson plan for teaching the Holocaust in schools, complete with a list of important written and audio-visual sources to use in the process. Significantly, the guide cites, quote, the many books written on the Holocaust, end quote. Another work I found was the book The Holocaust, The Destruction of European Jewry, 1933 to 1945, written by historian Nora Levin and published in 1968. This massive 768-page work is full of citations from a wide range of historical and academic sources. Unaware of the myth of silence, which would later develop, Levin writes, quote, "Source materials on the Holocaust are multiplying faster than they can be used," end quote, and mentions some of the scholarly work being done on the Holocaust at the time. Another work I found is The Holocaust Kingdom, a memoir, written by Jewish Holocaust survivor and journalist Alexander Donat, published in 1965. This 365-page book is a personal account of the Holocaust as Donat experienced it in Poland. Although this was not a scholarly publication, it was a major work detailing the Jewish experience of the Holocaust. Another work I found is The Dignity of the Destroyed, Towards a Definition of the Period of the Holocaust, a scholarly journal article by Dr. Saul Esch, published in 1962, addressing the question of exactly when the Holocaust began and when it could be said to have ended. Although short, Esch's article cites an active academic discussion over the duration of the Holocaust, indicating the subject was not being neglected. Another work I found was Hannah Arendt's book The Origins of Totalitarianism, first published in 1951. A considerable amount of this highly influential 550-page work addressed the Nazi persecution and attempted destruction of the Jewish people. Arendt was a leading historian in the study and analysis of the Holocaust and attended and reported on the 1960 trial of Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann. I could add more to this list, but the point has been made. Both Samaan and Tick also totally neglect the very public trials of Nazi war criminals during the very period when they insist the West was strategically silent on the Holocaust in an attempt to rehabilitate Nazi Germany's image. These trials include the 1952 trial of Emanuel Schaefer and other members of the Nazi SS for their participation in the death of over 5,000 Jewish people during their work in the Semlin death camp. The Friedrich Hildebrand trial of 1953, which charged this SS officer for his participation in the mass murder of Jewish people at the Borisov slave labor camp. The 1953 trial of Heimann, Kirspel and Meyerbeth, which charged 3 German soldiers for their work as guards at several of the Nazi death camps. The 1955 arrest of Karl Klauberg for his work at the Auschwitz death camp after public demands for justice from Holocaust survivors. Klauberg died in prison in 1957 before his trial commenced. The 1958 trial of Johann Paul Kremer for his work at the Auschwitz death camp. The Ulm Einsatzgruppen trial of 1958, which charged 10 members of the German Einsatzgruppen, part of the Nazi SS, with the murders of over 5,000 Jewish people. The trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1960 for his participation in the Holocaust. The 1962 trial of Karl Wolff for deporting 300,000 Jewish people to the Treblinka death camp. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, held from 1963 to 1968, which charged 25 staff of the Auschwitz death camp. The Sobibor trial, held from 1965 to 1966, which charged SS men of the Sobibor death camp. The 1967 trial of Philip Messenger for his work as a Nazi death camp guard. It is impossible to claim the West was attempting to stay silent on the Holocaust, given all these very public trials of Nazi Holocaust criminals were taking place. Again, more evidence could be added, but what I have already provided on this point overwhelmingly demonstrates that Samaan's claim is false, and Tick was wrong to rely on this inaccurate source. He should have done better research, consulting and citing relevant mainstream scholarly literature. Misrepresented sources. Tick cites a number of sources which he simply misrepresents, either because he does not understand them, or because he has not read them himself and is relying on what others say about them, or simply because he is not telling his audience everything he should about them. Rainer Zeitelmann. In his video, The Best Book I've Ever Read on Hitler and National Socialism, Tick recommends the book Hitler's National Socialism by Rainer Zeitelmann. This is a book which he used for his video claiming Hitler's National Socialism was generally socialist, not capitalist. In this video, Tick tells us Zeitelmann talks about, quote, the market, and then planning private ownership and nationalization, and Hitler's criticism of capitalism, end quote. Tick also says, quote, Zeitelmann has an entire section of this. One of the things is National Socialism as the synthesis between nationalism and socialism, end quote. In his video, Hitler's Socialism, Defeating the Counter-Arguments, Tick says, quote, Zeidelman thinks it's a socialist-like third way between Marxism and capitalism, end quote. Tick's phrasing here at least doesn't represent Zeidelman as identifying the Nazis as socialists, but saying they were socialist-like is still going beyond what Zeidelman actually says. Most importantly, Tick doesn't tell his viewers how Zeidelman contradicts Tick's own statements about the Nazi economy. Right at the start of his video, National Socialism Was Socialism, Rethinking World War II History, Tick says, quote, "What is National Socialism? National Socialism. National Communism. Whoa, wait a second. What? Yeah, let me explain," end quote. So he calls National Socialism National Communism. This is a one-for-one equivalence. He then goes on, saying, quote, "According to Marxists, modern society is capitalist, and communism is the goal. Socialism is what happens on the way to communism. Yes, I'm being super simple here, but this is the basic gist," end quote. So he claims that for Marxists, communism is the goal. Then he tells us for Hitler, socialism was the goal, and then tells us Hitler was actually moving towards communism, saying, quote, "For Hitler, socialism was the goal rather than the transition period. So yeah, Hitler was actually moving towards communism. I'm just going to let that sink in for a second," end quote. So according to Tick, socialism wasn't Hitler's end goal, communism was. Then at 12 minutes 15 seconds, Tick says, quote, "Hitler has spelt it out. What differentiates National Socialism from other Marxisms is race. It is socialism, but only for the Aryan," end quote. Here he says explicitly that National Socialism is a Marxism. It's just different to, quote, "other Marxisms," end quote. Again, at 14 minutes 15 seconds, talking about Nazi society, Tick says, quote, "The Marxist classless society ideal was redefined as a national community, but really these were the same thing," end quote. So again, he's drawing an equivalence between Hitler's national community and the ideal Marxist society. Again, at 15 minutes 12 seconds, he says, quote, "So do not think the German Nazi state in the 1930s and 40s is capitalism. It really isn't capitalism. It's a state-controlled economy. For the Nazis, socialism was state intervention in private business, rather than state ownership of business. Employer and employee remained, so long as they were part of the Aryan race. So yes, these guys are communists, basically, or at least they're more communist than they may have realized," end quote. There you have it. Tick calling the Nazis not just socialists, but communists. Now we're going to see Zeidelman contradict all of these statements from Tick. Zeidelman tells us Hitler was neither a Marxist nor communist, writing, quote, "Here again we see that Hitler's criticism of capital in his early speeches is exactly the opposite of the Marxist theory. It is of course erroneous to call Hitler a Marxist or a communist. While Marxism, at least in theory, demands the spread of democracy, for example through the Soviet democracy, Hitler fundamentally criticized the democratic principle of the majority decision," end quote. Zeidelman also tells us Hitler, quote, "recognized private ownership of the means of production and rejected nationalization," end quote. Though he does follow this up with some qualifications, Zeidelman never backs away from this statement. Zeidelman further tells us, quote, "In the Third Reich, private ownership was basically left untouched," end quote. Note how even Zeidelman only says that Hitler, quote, "used the possibility of nationalization as a threat," end quote, not that Hitler nationalized the economy or industry. Zeidelman also tells us, quote, "Hitler affirmed private ownership not only in front of industrialists, but also on other occasions, as, for example, in his speech to the Enabling Law on the 23rd of March 1933, end quote. He goes on to claim Hitler's support for private ownership was just, quote, "a camouflage for his real intentions," end quote, but given the fact that Zeidelman himself acknowledges, quote, "in the Third Reich, private ownership was basically left untouched," end quote, it is questionable whether Hitler really had any intentions other than what he achieved, which was the preservation of private capital and private ownership in the Third Reich. Despite all his threats of nationalization in his political and economic actions, Hitler continued to support private property and private capitalism, and never abolished either of them. So he not only claimed repeatedly in public and private to support private property and private capitalism, he literally actually did so politically and economically, despite having the full power to do otherwise. So we've just seen Zeitelman contradict a number of Tick's statements, and what's really important is that in the video in which Tick recommends Zeitelman's book, he never once quotes any of these statements from Zeitelman, nor does Tick tell his viewers how Zeitelman repeatedly contradicts his claim that Hitler was a real socialist and the Nazi economy was both socialist and aiming for real communism. In contrast to Tick, Zeitelman does not claim Hitler was a socialist. He differentiates Hitler and the Nazis from Marxism and communism, writing, quote, "Hitler's criticism of capital in his early speeches is exactly the opposite of the Marxist theory," end quote. And, quote, "It is of course erroneous to call Hitler a Marxist or a communist," end quote. Likewise, he says, quote, "While Marxism, at least in theory, demands the spread of democracy, for example, through the Soviet democracy, Hitler fundamentally criticized the democratic principle of the majority decision," end quote. Again, Tick doesn't tell his viewers that Zeitelman wrote this. Time magazine. In his video, Why Hitler Was Made Man of the Year in 1938, Tick presents an understanding of the Time magazine article on Hitler, which is so idiosyncratic, his video received repeated comments from viewers explaining how he had misunderstood the meaning of Time's Man of the Year designation and the Time magazine article itself. Right from the start, Tick makes it clear that he understands Time designated Hitler its Man of the Year as some kind of praise in support and admiration of Hitler's actions. All through this video, he quotes from the Time magazine article, using a tone of praise which is oddly incongruous with the article's actual content, which is openly criticizing Hitler. Tick did not understand that Time's characterization of someone as Person of the Year is not praise or endorsement of their character or actions. The person selected, according to Time's own statement, is a person who, quote, "for better or worse," end quote, has done, quote, "the most to influence the events of the year," end quote. Tick simply did not know this and thought it was some kind of award praising the person. This is the reason why he completely misunderstood the Time designation and its associated article. This myth is so persistent that Time magazine has found it necessary to correct it publicly several times. An article by the Reuters news organization states explicitly, quote, "Time magazine's designation of Adolf Hitler as Man of the Year for 1938 identified Hitler as, quote, the newsmaker who most influenced world events for better or worse," end quote, and was not an endorsement, the magazine has repeatedly clarified, end quote. Tick has completely misunderstood and consequently misrepresented his source. The Reuters article explains that the Time magazine cover for that year explicitly condemned Hitler, writing, quote, "Time named Hitler 1938's Man of the Year in its January 2, 1939 issue, whose cover illustration did not feature the portrait of Hitler in the circulating posts, but rather a black and white drawing depicting Hitler as a small figure playing a large organ with the caption, 'From the unholy organist, a hymn of hate,' end quote." I'll now quote from several of the comments Tick received from his own viewers, correcting his misunderstanding. One viewer wrote, quote, "Not to defend Time, their choices of Man of the Year have frequently been about who is important, not so much who deserves admiration," end quote. Another viewer wrote, quote, "Man of the Year used to be given to the person who made the most news that year, or were the most notable. In the last 40 years or so, it has evolved into a more honorific title. If you read the article with this knowledge, it sounds more critical of Hitler than the spin you gave it," end quote. Another reviewer wrote, quote, "I've learned that Man of the Year has no rating in itself, at least not in an only glorifying, positive way. It's just a person that has done something very considerable or history-changing, let it be for the worse or better, and thus became Man of the Year," end quote. Another reviewer wrote, quote, "Isn't the Time magazine Man of the Year award supposed to go to whoever made the biggest and most news of the year, whether it be for good or bad? So Hitler winning Time magazine Man of the Year isn't saying he was the best Man of the Year, but rather the worst. I could be wrong, but that's how I always took it," end quote. Another reviewer wrote, quote, "Over the years, since the 1970s, the editors have frequently made clear that Man and now Person of the Year is an individual that had the most impact or consequence, not necessarily one to be admired," end quote. Another reviewer wrote, quote, "Time magazine had often stated that the term Man of the Year, as well as Woman of the Year and Person of the Year was not meant to be an honorific, but just to note what personage affected the world most, for good or ill, which is why, as pointed out, Stalin would be Man of the Year a year later, and in more recent times Yuri Andropov, 1983, although he shared the title with Ronald Reagan. Just who agitated the world the most, end quote. There are over 1,600 comments on Tick's video, many more making the same point, so I could add to this list considerably, but what I have quoted will suffice. With all these comments correcting Tick, you might think he would respond and acknowledge his mistake. Well, he did respond to one viewer who wrote, quote, "Person of the Year has nothing to do with good or evil. It reflects the person's effect on the world," end quote. Instead of acknowledging his misunderstanding, Tick doubled down on it, replying, quote, "That's why Churchill was made Man of the Year in 1940, despite Hitler affecting the world much more than him, and why Roosevelt was made Man of the Year in 1941, despite Hitler being at the peak of his power," end quote. Another reviewer replied to Tick's response, aiming to help Tick understand the situation, writing, quote, "Could be because he already got it in 1938, and the magazine doesn't need to have a rigorous criteria, or because they would not risk being censored or having a very negative backlash, for now Hitler was a declared enemy of the Allied powers, with a major war going on. Maybe time and the public were just okay with Jew and Czech oppression, but not with Western European nations being oppressed afterwards," end quote. Tick made no further comments in this thread. Let's be clear on this. Tick completely misunderstood the primary source, which was the entire subject of his video, and maintained his misunderstanding despite being corrected by a significant number of people who independently understood Time magazine's actions accurately. The whole premise of Tick's video, which was his explanation for why Time made Hitler its Man of the Year for 1938, was completely wrong, and Tick seemingly could not understand this, despite it being pointed out to him repeatedly. Stanley G. Payne and Anthony James Gregor. In his videos on fascism, in particular his video Fascism Defined, the difference between fascism and National Socialism, Tick sometimes cites relevant specialist literature, in particular the works of political scientist Anthony James Gregor and historian Stanley G. Payne, both of whom have contributed significantly to the scholarly discussion of fascism. But as we will see, Tick misrepresents both of these authors by failing to tell readers that they contradict one of his fundamental arguments. In this video, Tick never uses the academic definition of fascism on which there has been a scholarly consensus among specialists for at least the last 30 years, summarized by political theorist Professor Roger Griffin, whose 1991 book, The Nature of Fascism, provided a highly condensed summary of this definition in the single sentence, quote, "Fascism is a genus of political ideology whose mythic core in its various permutations is a palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism," end quote. Palingenetic ultranationalism refers to an extremist form of nationalism dependent on a myth of national rebirth through the sweeping aside of a society which has supposedly become decadent and degenerate, returning it to a traditional ideal which allegedly existed in the nation's past. This was common to both Italian and German fascism. Griffin is one of the leading experts on the historical development of fascism and has been one of the most influential analysts of fascism as an ideology in both its historical and current forms. Why doesn't Tick cite him? Maybe he isn't aware of Griffin, in which case Tick's research on fascism hasn't been very deep or extensive. Maybe it's because he doesn't agree with Griffin, in which case Tick's choice of sources has been very selective. I think it's more likely Tick has simply never heard of Griffin because his research methodology on non-military topics typically doesn't involve consulting scholarly consensus or the most current academic works on these topics. I find it particularly odd that Tick doesn't cite Griffin or use Griffin's definition, given that in the list of sources for his video Fascism Defined, the difference between fascism and National Socialism, Tick lists historian Stanley Payne's book A History of Fascism 1914 to 1945, which explicitly cites Griffin, quotes his definition, and praises it. Quote, "This, once more, is accurate and useful, referring tersely to the cross-class populist appeal of fascist politics and its grounding in ultranationalism," end quote, though adding, quote, "Griffin's definition, while admirably succinct, cannot describe certain of the central characteristics fundamental to a definition of fascism," end quote. It's worth noting that Payne's book is a good scholarly source for fascism, even though it was written around 30 years ago in 1995, and even though Payne's definition is slightly different to what is now the academic consensus definition. Tick does not even use Payne's own definition of fascism, despite the fact that it agrees substantially with Griffin's. Perhaps this is because, unlike Tick, Payne identified the Nazis as fascists, writing that both Hitler's National Socialism and Italian fascism meet, quote, the basic fascist minimum, end quote, though adding, quote, yet sharp differences were also noticeable from the start, differences so profound that the two regimes can be grouped together only at a very general level of abstraction, end quote. In case you think that's Payne distancing the Nazis from fascism, he makes it very clear in his introduction that National Socialism was absolutely fascism, writing that it was in fact, quote, the most radical and developed form of fascism, end quote. Even if Tick didn't want to use Payne's definition of fascism, he could have at least told viewers that Payne identified National Socialism not only as indisputably fascism, but, quote, the most radical and developed form of fascism, end quote. So what does Tick quote from Payne? Well, despite Payne being in his list of sources, he never cites or quotes from Payne at all throughout the entire video. That's not necessarily wrong. I list sources in my video reference lists which I read to inform myself on the subject of the video, even if I didn't quote or cite them in the video. That's common scholarly practice. But given the fact that Payne actually contradicts Tick's claim that National Socialism wasn't fascism, Tick would have done his readers a service by informing them that one of the sources he read disagreed with him, and by explaining Payne's view in at least some detail. In contrast, Tick cites Anthony James Gregor's work, Mussolini's Intellectuals, Fascist Social and Political Thought, several times, praising it as a, quote, fantastic book, end quote. He bases a significant part of his analysis of Italian fascism on Gregor's work. But, as with Payne, Tick doesn't tell his readers that in this very book, Gregor identifies National Socialism as fascism, writing, quote, a variant of fascism, Adolf Hitler's National Socialism, end quote, which completely contradicts Tick's claim that National Socialism was not fascism. It's okay for Tick to disagree with Payne and Gregor in this way, but I do think he should tell his audience that he disagrees with them, especially Gregor, given the way Tick cites him so frequently in the video. Why does Tick avoid specialist scholarship? It is noteworthy that when it comes to subjects well outside his area of personal knowledge or academic qualifications, Tick's videos repeatedly demonstrate misunderstandings of the topic and sometimes even the sources he uses. It's particularly noticeable when he deals with economics, political ideology, especially Nazism, socialism and fascism, philosophy, and religion, especially Gnosticism. As we've seen, in his videos on fascism, he uses some very good specialist literature, but doesn't inform readers when these sources contradict his own argument. In fact, his interpretation of fascism's origins and definition is more influenced by objectivists and Austrian school libertarians. For example, in his video, This is the Actual Idea Behind Fascism, he cites Peikoff to explain what Tick considers to be the philosophical origin of Giovanni Gentile's concept of fascism. In his video, Hegel's Idiobabble is the basis of Marxism and Fascism, Tick again cites Peikoff to explain what Tick considers to be the philosophical origin of fascism. For his video, Fascism Defined, the difference between fascism and National Socialism, he cites self-described Austrian economics libertarian Adam Young in his list of sources. Frequently, when dealing with such subjects, Tick makes up his own definitions for key terms. He sometimes misunderstands or misrepresents his own sources, his sources aren't even good, and he cites fringe or outdated material, often non-academic sources which haven't been peer-reviewed or even gone through a formal independent editorial process, instead of citing up-to-date scholarly sources. Notably, Tick seems to have an aversion to citing the scholarly consensus on these subjects or agreeing with it when he does cite it. Why is this? Why does Tick often not use specialist scholarship on specialist non-military topics? What is the reason why we don't see him citing academic consensus on these topics? Why doesn't he consistently cite recognized scholarly works which are up to date and peer-reviewed on these topics? Perhaps he isn't very good at doing research. I think that's wrong because he seems to know exactly where to go to find up-to-date sources on military history. He's demonstrated awareness of scholarly consensus and major works on military history. And on a number of occasions, he has advised his audience when sources on military history have become outdated or when the scholarly consensus has changed or been challenged. I don't think it's just because Tick isn't familiar with these subjects either, because you don't necessarily need to be familiar with the subject in order to know how to become familiar with it. And that doesn't require you to become an expert on it either. It just requires you to understand the current scholarly consensus and the major works in the field. I have spent many months becoming familiar with subjects I was previously uninformed on, and I am sure Tick has the research skills necessary to identify the best academic sources and scholarly consensus on those non-military subjects he covers in his videos. There are a few lines of evidence which suggest to me why Tick's videos on these other subjects typically don't cite specialist scholarship, the academic consensus, or peer-reviewed scholarly works. One line of evidence is that on some of these subjects, he simply prefers sources which already agree with him, regardless of their bias, or whether they're academic, or whether they've been peer-reviewed. That's particularly obvious in his videos covering economic topics, since, as we've seen, he has a clear preference for citing authors who are libertarians or Austrian school economists. Another line of evidence is that sometimes it's clear he is citing sources which he has found in other sources without checking if they're up to date or accurate or even relevant. That's particularly obvious in his videos on Gnosticism and philosophy, since in those videos he not only cites James Lindsay, but cites the same sources as James Lindsay, sources it's clear he hasn't always read for himself. I think he just cited the same sources as Lindsay on the assumption that Lindsay's research was reliable, and repeated Lindsay's arguments because he assumed they were correct, and also because they aligned with his own views on Marxism and the culture war. This really wasn't proper research. We've also seen it in his video on Hitler and Time magazine, in which he simply assumed Samaan was correct when he claimed there had been a silence on the Holocaust from the beginning of the Cold War to the end of the 1970s. He just never checked to see if this was true. A third line of evidence is found in various statements he has made in his videos, expressing the belief that academia is unreliable, having been compromised by political ideologues, an idea we've already seen expressed indirectly in his Time magazine video, in which he told us that government elites suppressed knowledge of the Holocaust for ideological reasons, aided by academics. However, we find it expressed even more clearly in his video Why They Don't Tell You About Hitler's Shrinking Markets Problem, published on the 9th of July 2019. In this video, he claims, quote, "Since the Cold War era, if not much earlier, socialists have invaded the universities and have been miseducating the youth. Think about it. Who writes the history books? Public, socialized, state academic historians. And who teaches in these public, socialized state schools? People who believe in socialized control of the means of production." End quote. Note that he dates the start of this alleged corruption from the commencement of the Cold War era, just like we've seen him do in his Time magazine video. Tick then explains his university invasion idea in more detail, asserting, quote, "These socialized state historians and these socialized state academics have the most to gain from the further expansion of the public socialized state sector. So they're pushing a false narrative of history, a false narrative of the news, a false definition of the words we use in everyday language, like state, all as a way of defending real socialism, the state." End quote. In the same video, Tick also comments on the social sciences, asserting, quote, "They've spun history through the lens of class warfare, gender warfare, racial warfare, calling this social science. They've warped society into misunderstanding the true nature of socialism and capitalism." End quote. This might explain why his videos on certain humanities subjects, especially philosophy and religion, typically don't cite from mainstream academic literature or cite scholarly consensus. It would certainly explain why he's so ready to accept Peikoff's views on these subjects, despite the fact that Peikoff's assertions are biased by his objectivist views and the fact that Peikoff's own works on these subjects are typically idiosyncratic, outside scholarly consensus, and not academically peer-reviewed. So the next time you watch one of Tick's videos, especially on a subject other than military history, and he cites sources and links to his source list in the video description, remember that despite the number of sources he cites and their apparent authority, they may be biased, they may be incorrect, or he may simply be misrepresenting them, either through omission or lack of understanding. And remember, this goes for all videos with citations and source lists on YouTube, including my own. If you want to know more about the research weaknesses in Tick's videos, see the links in the video description to some of my critiques of Tick and some by others, including history YouTuber Freda.